"I'm sorry, but we'll need you to move," the flight attendant said. Her tone clipped, her eyes refusing to meet theirs. Walter Greaves blinked. "We just sat down." "Yes, sir, but one of our VIP passengers has requested your seats." Henrietta tightened her grip on her purse, her other hand clenching the boarding pass she'd been so proud to hold just minutes ago. The paper now crinkled slightly in her palm. A young woman in a white blazer stood just a few rows back, arms crossed, an expensive leather tote hanging on her forearm like a trophy. Her expression didn't hide much. In fact, it said everything. "You two don't belong here." Walter didn't raise his voice. He never did. "These are our assigned seats," Henrietta said quietly, voice trembling. "2A and 2B, first class. It's printed right here." The flight supervisor stepped in. "We understand that, ma'am, but if you don't comply, we may need to involve security." And just like that, the cabin air got thinner. The cheerful hum of boarding chatter vanished behind a wall of tension. Walter looked down, adjusted his wedding ring, and then, with calm precision, reached inside his blazer. What he pulled out wasn't anger or outrage or even protest. It was a sleek black device. Something no one in that aisle expected a retired old man to carry. And with one silent tap, everything began to change. 30 minutes earlier, everything had been perfectly normal. The waiting area at Seattle Boeing Field wasn't nearly as chaotic as the larger airports. That was partly why Walter had chosen it. Smaller terminals, fewer distractions, easier for Henrietta's knees. The couple had been married for 52 years. He still offered his arm when they walked. She still reminded him when his collar was sticking up. They were on their way to Phoenix to attend their niece's engagement dinner, just a short, 2-day trip. First class was Walter's gift to Henrietta. A little surprise. She had gasped when he handed her the printed boarding passes. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." The upgrade had cost nothing. Technically, just a few unspent miles and a phone call. But that wasn't what mattered. Henrietta hadn't flown first class since their 30th anniversary cruise to Barcelona. That was 15 years and one hip replacement ago. At the gate, they sipped coffee and traded guesses about how extravagant the proposal party would be. Henrietta leaned on Walter's shoulder, reading the Sunday crossword from her tablet. Walter didn't read anything. He watched. Always had. "Boarding Group 1, the agent called. Walter stood first, offering his hand to his wife like it was 1972 all over again. "Shall we, madam?" She chuckled. "You're in a good mood." "I'm with you, and we're not in coach." As they stepped onto the aircraft, Walter nodded to the flight attendant at the door. "Good morning." The attendant barely looked up. "Welcome," Henrietta said. "2A and 2B," with a warm smile. No reply. They walked forward, placed their bags overhead, and settled into the plush leather seats. Henrietta let out a little sigh of happiness as she leaned back. "Oh, Walter, this is lovely." He smiled. "You deserve it." Everything was fine, until the sound of aggressive heels echoed down the jet bridge. A young woman strode aboard like she owned the plane. White blazer, tight ponytail, big energy. She stopped at row 2 and stared at them like they were lost children sitting in her dining room chairs. She didn't speak to them at first, just turned to the attendant, exasperated. "I'm supposed to be here," she snapped. The flight attendant, young, clearly flustered, checked her tablet. "Ma'am, your seat is actually 6C aisle." "That's not what I requested. I told the agent I needed to be near the front. My father's a U.S. senator. I have priority." Henrietta winced at the tone. The attendant hesitated. "Let me check with my supervisor." The woman didn't wait. She turned and looked directly at Walter and Henrietta. "Wouldn't it just be easier if you two switched?" Walter's eyebrows lifted. "I don't believe we've met." "I'm not trying to be rude," the woman said, "but I'm on a tight schedule, and I can't sit that far back." Henrietta smiled politely. "We understand, but these are our assigned seats." The woman folded her arms. "You really need to make this difficult?" Walter said nothing. He simply stared at her. Calm, steady, unmoving. Minutes later, the supervisor arrived. "I apologize, folks, but we do need to ask you to relocate to row 21. It's still an aisle pair. We'll provide complimentary drinks and a $100 flight credit for the inconvenience." Henrietta's voice cracked slightly. "Is this standard?" The supervisor glanced over her shoulder. "We do our best to accommodate all guests, but some passengers carry priority status." Walter didn't answer immediately. His breathing was calm, steady. "What happens if we say no?" "There may be consequences," the supervisor replied, with just enough steel in her tone to hint at escalation. Walter exhaled through his nose. Henrietta touched his hand. "Let's not make trouble." He nodded slowly. "All right." They gathered their things. Walter bent down to retrieve his tablet case. He slipped the device inside his coat pocket without a word. As they walked past the woman now lounging in 2A, she gave them a half smile. "Thanks for understanding." Henrietta didn't respond. Walter didn't look at her. They reached row 21. Narrower seats. Less leg room. Already occupied overhead bins. Walter helped Henrietta sit, then buckled in beside her. She stared ahead, cheeks flushed with quiet humiliation. "Walter," she whispered, "maybe we should have said something." He shook his head. "We did." He reached inside his jacket and pulled out the black tablet again. The screen came to life with a faint blue glow. Henrietta watched as he tapped in a passcode. Then another. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. Walter didn't look up. "I'm filing a live flag into the Blue Signal Ethics Network," he said. Henrietta blinked. "That still exists?" Walter's voice was calm. "I never turned it off." She nodded slowly, understanding now. Years ago, Walter had been one of the key architects of a federal aviation system called Blue Signal Access, a secure gateway that allowed real-time coordination between approved airlines and major federal terminals. And buried within that system was a little-known emergency feature. Skylock Protocol. One code, one activation. And 19 of the country's most important airports could instantly deny operational access to any airline that breached ethical compliance. It had only ever been used once. Until now. 25,000 feet above Oregon, the flight cruised steadily through a blanket of clouds. Passengers flipped through magazines, fidgeted with seatbelts, and settled into their snacks. The turbulence was minor, the sky smooth. But somewhere far below, the real storm had already begun. Inside the cabin of Flight 2317, no one, not even the flight crew, knew that a silent alert had just been triggered from seat 21A. Walter Greaves sat still, his eyes focused on the narrow screen of his black tablet. On the surface, it looked like any old e-reader, but the glowing blue interface told another story. Henrietta leaned toward him. "Did it go through?" He nodded once. "Yes, time-stamped, geotagged, logged into central clearance records," she whispered. "Will they even notice it?" "They'll notice." Walter tapped one more command and placed the tablet gently back into his coat. Then he folded his hands in his lap, like nothing happened. Back in row 2, the woman in white, Margaret Drummond, snapped a selfie with her mimosa. The flash caught Henrietta's eye. "She's really proud of herself," Henrietta muttered. Walter didn't respond, but there was something in his face, something Henrietta hadn't seen in years. A stillness, not of peace, but of resolve. Meanwhile, in a modest federal facility buried within a data center just outside Sacramento, a soft ping echoed across the operations floor. "Flag code 37, someone called out. "Coming through Blue Signal Ethics channel?" A technician squinted at his screen. "Ethics flag? We haven't seen one of those in years." Another leaned over. "Who filed it?" He tapped, paused, his brows raised. "Whoa. What?" "Final validator, Walter Greaves." The room went quiet. You didn't speak the name Walter Greaves lightly in these circles. He wasn't just the architect of Blue Signal, he was its conscience. He'd helped design the Skylock Protocol, a last resort function to temporarily freeze an airline's access to federal terminals when a breach of passenger dignity reached critical mass. It had never been used without merit, and it had never been questioned. The lead coordinator stood up. Send verification to the FAA ethics liaison. This is going to escalate fast. Back on the plane, Henrietta was rereading the snack menu without seeing any of it. Do you think they'll say something? The airline? Walter tilted his head slightly. Eventually. Just then, 2 rows up. A flight attendant whispered something to her supervisor. The 2 of them both turned, very subtly, and looked toward row 21. Henrietta caught the glance. They're feeling it, Walter said. The warning has a signature. Someone at corporate just got a notice that one of their flights triggered a compliance flag, signed by the system's original architect. Henrietta stared at him. You signed it? He gave her a small smile. I signed it with my name, not just a code. Henrietta's breath caught. Walter, she said, you're serious. I'm old, he replied quietly, not irrelevant. Back on the ground, at Sky Nova Airlines headquarters in Denver, chaos was unfolding. Within 6 minutes of the ethics flag, internal systems lit up with red alerts. 3 major federal airports, Denver, Chicago Midway, and Phoenix Sky Harbor, received automatic pre-suspension warnings. A manager rushed into the office of COO Trina Marshall, phone in hand. Trina, we've got an emergency blue signal freeze request on flight 2317. Trina looked up from her espresso. What? Filed from inside the flight. Passenger logged a Skylock ethics violation. It's already escalated to FAA. Which passenger? He held out the tablet. Walter Greaves. Trina's face paled. No way. He used the master key. It's clean. No spoofing. He flagged our crew. Trina slammed her mug down. Who let that man board our plane? On board, tension had begun to build. Flight attendants whispered near the galley, eyes darting between row 2 and the rear cabin. The younger attendant, Rachel, approached Margaret Drummond, who was now reclining with her headphones in and a second mimosa half finished. Excuse me, Miss Drummond, she said cautiously. Would you mind confirming your seat assignment again? Margaret rolled her eyes. I was told this seat was mine by the supervisor. Yes, but we may need to re-verify a few things. Margaret waved a dismissive hand. No, I'm fine right here. I already took my shoes off. Rachel bit her tongue and walked away. Henrietta noticed. They're starting to panic. Walter nodded. The crew doesn't know yet, but someone up top just got a very expensive wake-up call. At FAA headquarters in DC, a red-level notification had been triggered for only the 3rd time in 2 decades. A compliance officer named Hector Briggs was reading the case file with a growing knot in his stomach. Greaves? He whispered aloud. He used his own name? Within seconds, his phone rang. Yeah, he answered. This is compliance control. Confirm blue signal Skylock activation from flight 2317. Confirmed, he replied. And it's coming from the man who built the protocol. What's his charge? Hector scrolled. Passenger displacement, retaliation, racial bias, crew negligence, ethical breach severity, tier 4. He stood. Okay, this just became federal. At 30,000 feet, things were still quiet. Uncomfortably so. Then the seatbelt light blinked on again, even though the skies were smooth. Henrietta looked around. Why the sudden seatbelt sign? Walter folded his arms. They're buying time, he said, trying to keep everyone still. From the front cabin, the lead flight attendant emerged, supervisor tag shining. She approached row 21. Mr. and Mrs. Greaves? She asked gently. Henrietta looked up. Yes? We'd like to apologize for the earlier inconvenience. It appears there may have been a system issue during seat assignment. Walter said nothing. Would you be willing, the supervisor continued, to return to your original seats? Henrietta raised an eyebrow. You mean the ones we were pressured to give up? The woman swallowed. Yes, ma'am. We'd like to make things right. Margaret Drummond was no longer sipping champagne. She sat upright now, visibly irritated. "What's going on?" she snapped. "Why are they talking to them?" The crew ignored her. Walter stood slowly. "We'll return to our seats, but I won't be accepting any apology from crew who used the word security on my wife." The attendant's face turned red. "Understood, sir." As they passed row 2 again, Margaret stared up, eyes narrowing. "What the hell is this?" Walter didn't look at her. He simply sat down, adjusted his seatbelt, and opened Walden again. Henrietta took his hand and whispered, "You're something else." 6 minutes later, on the ground, Sky Nova stock began to dip. Not dramatically, but enough. Investors noticed that something was happening. By the time Flight 2317 touched down in Phoenix, 3 terminals had suspended Sky Nova's access. Luggage was delayed. Flights rerouted. Newsrooms started asking questions. The FAA's emergency ethics review was now public. In the cabin, the landing was smooth, but no one applauded. Walter stood, retrieved their bags, and offered his arm to Henrietta. The same supervisor from before was waiting at the door, face pale. "There's a car waiting for you, sir," she said. "On behalf of the airline," Henrietta smiled. "He doesn't need your car, but you're going to need his forgiveness." Walter nodded politely. "You might want to call corporate." "Why?" she asked, confused. He looked her in the eye for the first time that day. Because Flight 2317 just made history. By the time Flight 2317 taxied to Gate 19 at Phoenix Sky Harbor, the world beneath it had already started shifting. The captain hadn't said much on descent, just the usual lines. "Thanks for flying with us. Hope you enjoy your stay." Nothing about what had transpired 30,000 feet in the air. Nothing about the call to FAA. Nothing about the silent code that had rerouted the airline's future mid-flight. Inside the cabin, the tension was thick enough to taste. Walter and Henrietta remained in their reclaimed seats, 2A and 2B, quiet but calm, hands folded. Across the aisle, Margaret Drummond was a storm contained by seatbelt. Her jaw was tight, her expression shifting from indignant to confused to full-blown panic. Something had changed, but no one had bothered to tell her what. That, in itself, drove her mad. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, people stood up with the usual impatience. But the crew wasn't rushing to open the door. Not this time. Instead, a message buzzed across the flight attendant's handheld device. "Hold cabin. FAA response pending. Do not deplane." Rachel, the younger flight attendant, read the text, then glanced at the lead supervisor. "What do we do?" The supervisor didn't answer right away. She walked toward the front of the cabin, leaned against the cockpit door, and whispered through the slit. Moments later, the captain's voice came back on. Calm, too calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be holding briefly at the gate due to an unexpected clearance delay. We appreciate your patience." Henrietta raised an eyebrow. "Clearance delay?" Walter didn't answer. He was watching the reflection in the window. A security vehicle had pulled up beside the jet bridge. 2 men in suits stood by the car. They weren't airport staff. They weren't with the airline. Henrietta followed his gaze. "Are those?" "Yes," Walter said quietly. "FAA ethics officers." Inside Sky Nova Airlines headquarters in Denver, the executive floor was in chaos. The internal alert system was still pinging. 3 major federal airports had now suspended Sky Nova's real-time clearance credentials. Denver International, Chicago Midway, Phoenix Sky Harbor. Gate access denied. Flight scheduling frozen. $117 million worth of operations interrupted. The CEO, Marissa DeWitt, had flown back early from a shareholder retreat in Aspen. She entered the boardroom just as her chief operating officer was wrapping up a call. "Tell me this is a mistake," Marissa snapped. Trina, the COO, turned pale. "It's not. We've been flagged. Skylock protocol. Triggered from Flight 231SN. Who the hell still has Skylock credentials?" Trina slid a file across the table. Walter Greaves. Marissa froze. As in, the Walter Greaves? The one who built Blue Signal. The one who wrote the original flight ethics mandate in '04. Yes. Marissa rubbed her temple. We displaced a passenger, and that passenger was him? Technically, we displaced his wife. Silence. Then, get me the FAA. Now. Back on the plane, Margaret Drummond was starting to lose her composure. She pressed the call button. A chime echoed. No one came. She hit it again. Finally, Rachel approached. Ma'am? I've been sitting here for 10 minutes. I have a connection. I'm supposed to be out of this plane already. What's the holdup? There's a delay with the gate release, Rachel said carefully. Margaret scoffed. You mean that old man's little stunt got the FAA involved? Rachel didn't answer. Margaret leaned forward, lowering her voice. Do you have any idea who I am? Who my father is? Rachel swallowed. We're aware. Well, I expect to be treated accordingly. Rachel held her ground. We're following protocol, ma'am. Margaret rolled her eyes. You people wouldn't know protocol if it slapped you. Behind her, passengers were listening now, watching. The tide of sympathy was shifting. Back in row 3, a middle-aged man whispered to his wife, Is she the one that made the old couple move? His wife nodded. Yep, saw it all. The guy didn't even say a word, just moved. Now she's fuming. They always lose when they underestimate the quiet ones. Outside the aircraft, 2 FAA officers had entered the jet bridge. One approached the crew. Captain Hayes? Yes, sir, the pilot said, stepping forward. I'm Officer Landon, FAA Ethics Division. We need to speak with you, your cabin supervisor, and 2 passengers, Walter and Henrietta Greaves, before this flight is released. The captain blinked. That serious? Officer Landon held up a document. You've been flagged under Skylock. We've confirmed a Tier 4 ethics breach involving passenger mistreatment. We're grounding your crew pending review. Captain Hayes turned pale. But No one's being arrested, Landon said. But this goes straight to Washington. Your airline's operations at 19 federal terminals are now under review. Inside the plane, the PA system dinged again. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice came on, shakier this time. We're now preparing to deplane. We ask that you remain seated until our cabin crew assists you row by row. We also have officials from FAA who will be speaking to a few passengers. Thank you for your cooperation. Henrietta glanced at Walter. Well, they're here. Walter nodded and stood slowly. Rachel appeared again, this time with genuine nervousness in her voice. Mr. Greaves? Mrs. Greaves? The FAA would like a word with you. If you'd please follow me. Walter took Henrietta's hand. After you, dear. They walked past Margaret, who looked up sharply. I hope you're happy. Walter finally looked her in the eyes. I didn't make the system, he said. I just built in a way to hold it accountable. In the terminal, a private conference room had been set aside. The FAA officers offered water, spoke respectfully. They weren't here to interrogate. They were here to document. Walter gave them a calm, complete account. No exaggeration, just facts. Henrietta spoke too, steady and clear. Do you feel this was racially motivated? One officer asked gently. Henrietta paused. Maybe, maybe not. But I do know we were asked to move without explanation. That she was younger, louder, and assumed she had the right to displace us. That part's not race, it's entitlement. Walter added, the issue isn't just her, it's how quickly the crew folded, how easily they were willing to push aside 2 paying passengers to avoid confronting someone louder. The FAA officers nodded. This statement helps, one said. It's part of a growing pattern. Meanwhile, back at FAA headquarters, media alerts had started lighting up. One tweet went viral. Just witnessed an elderly couple kicked out of first class for some VIP Karen. Now FAA's here. Something big's going down. Hashtag flight to another followed. You never know who you're messing with on a plane. Apparently that old man designed the system that controls airport access. By the time Walter and Henrietta stepped into their waiting car, 3 media outlets had already published preliminary stories about the Skylock passenger. As the black SUV pulled away from the terminal, Henrietta leaned back into the leather seat. "I thought we were just going to a family dinner," she said softly. Walter looked out the window. "We are, just with a little layover in accountability." She smiled. "You're going to become a meme." He shrugged. Maybe it's time people remembered what quiet power looks like. By the time Walter and Henrietta Greaves returned to their quiet estate in Flagstaff, Arizona, the world outside wasn't quiet anymore. It had been just 6 hours since Flight 2317 landed. But in today's world, 6 hours was an eternity. Someone in row 4 had recorded everything on a cell phone. Margaret Drummond's voice, her pointed demand, her hand gesturing toward the elderly black couple. The video captured Walter helping Henrietta stand without a word, lifting their carry-on bags. And Rachel, the flight attendant, standing frozen, unsure, complicit by silence. The video didn't show Walter's call, but the consequences of it didn't need footage. Because by the time most Americans had finished breakfast, Sky Nova Airlines had already lost access to 3 major airports. And now everyone was asking the same question. Who was the man in seat 2A? In Washington, D.C., FAA Commissioner Lauren Haynes faced the press. She didn't read from the prepared statement. She set it aside and looked the room in the eye. "We've reviewed the incident on Sky Nova Flight 2317. The Skylock ethics override was activated by Mr. Walter Greaves, a retired federal infrastructure director and the final approver of the Blue Signal framework." Reporters froze. A few gasps. As a result of the breach in passenger ethics, specifically the targeting and displacement of an elderly black couple, the FAA has suspended Sky Nova's clearance at 17 national terminals. The airline's ethics score is downgraded to non-compliant. An industry-wide audit is now underway. One journalist stood. "Is this the first time the Skylock system has ever been used?" "Yes," Haynes said calmly. "It was built for moments when every other system fails, and in this case, they did." At Sky Nova's Crisis HQ, the energy was pure chaos. The CEO, Marissa DeWitt, hadn't slept. Her voice was hoarse. The numbers on the screen behind her kept climbing. $143 million in losses from grounded flights, 19 international flights canceled, 3 major ESG funds pulling inquiries, airline removed from 3 global booking platforms. "Does he have a lawyer?" Marissa demanded. "Who?" "Walter Greaves." "No, he hasn't spoken to the media. He hasn't hired legal." "Then why are we bleeding like this?" A legal officer in the back finally spoke. "Because we didn't just disrespect a man, we disrespected the system he built." Walter was at home in Arizona, barefoot on the back patio, coffee in hand, watching the desert breathe under sunrise. Henrietta came out behind him with a blanket. "You're on the front page," she said, holding out the newspaper. Walter squinted at the headline, "The Man Who Silenced the Skies." "Haven't been in the Times since '04, he murmured. "They said you made the system kneel." With a phone call. Walter shook his head. "That's not what happened." No, I didn't make it kneel. I reminded it what dignity looks like." Henrietta smiled gently. "You know this won't end here." He didn't answer, but he didn't disagree either. On social media, the movement exploded. C2A began trending across platforms. Stories from passengers poured in. Elderly travelers denied assistance. Disabled passengers asked to move for convenience. People of color disrespected in subtle, constant ways. But Walter Greaves never posted a word. Instead, others spoke for him. A veterans group shared his resume. Civil rights advocates circulated the 2004 Passenger Ethics Act, which Walter had co-authored. TikToks and Instagram reels played slow clips of him helping Henrietta move their bags. Captioned, "He didn't raise his voice, but the system still heard him." The fallout at Sky Nova was seismic. After days of PR disaster, The board voted 10-2 to remove Marissa DeWitt as CEO. A temporary ethics oversight board was formed. Negotiations began with the FAA to restore limited access to terminals. But this time, the FAA wasn't just taking calls. They were demanding reform. And one name kept coming up: Walter Greaves. Walter flew to DC, quietly, alone. No fanfare. Just a man in a gray suit, holding a slim black briefcase. In a closed-door meeting, the FAA offered him something no one had expected: the chance to co-author and implement a new flight dignity protocol, a binding charter that would govern every airline receiving federal support or terminal access. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you didn't ask for this," said Commissioner Haynes. "And because the country trusts you more than it trusts any airline right now." Walter exhaled slowly. "Then I want 3 things." "Name them." 1. Mandatory ethics training for all crew, not just at hiring, but annually. 2. A cabin-integrated ethics alert system tied to Skylock. 3. Real consequences for repeat violations, public, enforceable, and non-negotiable. Haynes nodded. "Done." 2 weeks later, the announcement went public. The FAA unveiled the Flight Dignity Protocol, authored by Walter and a bipartisan panel. All flight staff must complete annual ethics certification, new anonymous passenger complaint system routes directly to FAA Ethics Division. Any airline that fails the quarterly compliance score will face Skylock suspension. For the first time, passengers had real-time protections, not just policies. No one clapped, no one made grand speeches. They just listened. And for once, that was enough. As for Margaret Drummond, she vanished from public view. Her father, a powerful law partner, relocated her abroad. There was no statement, no apology. Walter never mentioned her again. He didn't need to, because what he built outlived any single offender. Back in Flagstaff, Walter trimmed rosemary in the garden while Henrietta sat nearby, sorting envelopes. "These are from a civics class in Philadelphia," she said. "10th graders." Walter took a letter and read quietly. "You made the world pause, sir, without yelling, just by standing up and doing what's right. That gives me hope." He folded the letter slowly and set it on the table. Then he looked out at the open desert and murmured, "God willing, they'll build something better with that hope." Henrietta didn't say anything. She just reached for his hand and held it. The air inside the Senate chamber felt heavier than usual. Walter sat quietly, second row from the front, as the hearing room filled with press, policy advisors, and airline lobbyists who looked like they'd age 10 years in a week. The Flight 2317 incident wasn't just a scandal anymore. It had become a catalyst. At the front of the room, Senator Maribel Connor from New York tapped her gavel twice. "This hearing will come to order. Our topic: passenger discrimination in federally regulated airspace and the FAA's ethics enforcement oversight." To Walter's left, Henrietta gave his hand a soft squeeze. She wore a simple navy blouse and her pearl earrings. Subtle, dignified, like always. Maribel looked around the room. Her eyes landed on Walter. "We're joined today by Mr. Walter Greaves, former Federal Infrastructure Director and primary author of the Blue Signal Framework." Someone whispered, "That's him," like they were pointing out a ghost from American folklore. But Walter didn't blink. He'd walked through war zones and policy rooms far colder than this. The senator continued, "We're also joined by FAA Commissioner Lauren Haynes, ethics expert Dr. Keon Fields, and Sky Nova Interim Ethics Director Linda Morano." A murmur rippled through the room as Linda took her seat. The airline had sent someone, finally. Connor raised an eyebrow. "Before we begin formal testimony, I'd like to address what most of you are here for." She looked again at Walter. The Skylock override was never supposed to be touched. It was an emergency mechanism buried so deep in federal aviation code, half the current agency didn't even know it was real. But Mr. Greaves not only used it, he used it correctly, and that should terrify all of you. A few corporate attorneys shifted in their chairs. After opening remarks, Walter was invited to speak. He rose slowly, walked to the witness seat. No notes, no podium, just his voice. "I don't care about viral videos or political points," he began. "I care about what happened to my wife." The room fell still. "She is 79 years old. We were asked to move from our paid, confirmed seats. Not because of a policy, not because of safety, but because someone didn't like how we looked sitting there. And no one, not a single crew member, intervened." He paused, eyes clear, voice low but firm. "Every passenger has a right to dignity, especially those who've been denied it their entire lives. The system didn't just fail that day, it failed long before." Reporters scribbled so fast, the scratch of pens sounded like rain. Walter turned to the Sky Nova rep. "And don't you dare tell me it was a misunderstanding. It was a pattern, and we all know it." Linda Morano kept her face neutral, but she couldn't meet his eyes. Later, Commissioner Haynes took the mic to break down how the ethics compliance infrastructure would change moving forward. "We are implementing the Flight Dignity Protocol effective immediately," she said. "All US-based airlines will be required to certify annually that their training, hiring, and in-flight practices comply with anti-discrimination standards defined by the FAA Ethics Office." A senator interrupted. "Will those standards be public?" "They will now," Haynes confirmed. "For the first time ever, we're creating a publicly accessible dashboard, the Sky Ethics Index, where passengers can view any airline's live ethics score, complaint resolution time, and compliance history." A gasp. That alone would shake the industry. Dr. Keon Field stepped up next, outlining what systemic retraining would look like. "Too many airlines teach compliance like a checklist, but ethics isn't a task. It's a culture, and if you don't build it, incidents like Flight 231 will keep happening." Back at the Greaves home that evening, Walter turned on the news just long enough to hear the anchor say, "This hearing marks the most sweeping ethics reform in airline history." He switched it off. Henrietta brought him tea and sat beside him on the porch swing. "Well?" she asked. Walter let out a long breath. "We did what we had to do, but now the hard part starts." She nodded, enforcing it. 2 days later, emails flooded in from pilots, flight attendants, and even gate agents. Some said thank you. Others said, "I've seen what you saw." One former Sky Nova crew member sent a confidential log showing 43 internal complaints of racial bias within a 12-month period. None of them escalated. Walter forwarded it directly to Commissioner Haynes. She replied with one sentence, "We'll make it count." Meanwhile, Sky Nova's stock continued its descent. Investors panicked. Foreign governments reevaluated partnerships. To regain FAA clearance, the airline was forced to sign a legal agreement granting real-time audit access to their onboard behavior reports. And in a historic move, the FAA announced a 90-day grace period for all airlines to adopt the new Passenger Integrity Charter, authored in part by Walter. But the deadline came with teeth. Any airline that failed to meet it would lose federal contract eligibility, and in some cases, airport gate privileges entirely. A memo from FAA leaked days later. It read, "Compliance is no longer optional. Passenger dignity is a federal standard." While systems scrambled, something else happened online. An independent journalist named Maya Petrelli launched a docuseries called The Man in 2A. The first episode got 3.1 million views in 24 hours. It wasn't sensational. It was quiet. Clips of Walter and Henrietta gardening, reading, walking together near the red Arizona cliffs. Voiceovers from passengers who said they'd seen the Greaveses on flights over the years. Always kind, always gracious. And at the end, Maya spoke directly into the camera. "He didn't go viral because he was loud. He went viral because we're all tired of pretending silence fixes anything." One night, as they walked through their neighborhood, a young black couple stopped their car and rolled down the window. "Excuse us, sir," the man said. "Are you Mr. Greaves?" Walter smiled softly. Yes, we just wanted to say thank you for what you did. My mom cried when she saw the hearing. Henrietta placed a hand over her heart. Tell her she wasn't the only one. The woman in the passenger seat leaned out. You didn't just stand up for you. You stood up for all of us. Walter shook the man's hand, then hers. He didn't have to say a word. His eyes said enough. The following week, Walter received a formal invitation from the White House. The card read, "You are hereby invited to witness the signing of the Passenger Integrity Charter into federal aviation law." He placed it on the mantel. "I never thought I'd be called back into service at this age," he said. Henrietta chuckled. "Some people retire with a watch. You ground a $620 million system and rewrite federal law." Walter raised an eyebrow. "I still want my watch." The last scene of the chapter is quiet. Henrietta dozes off in her armchair with a book in her lap. Walter stands at the window, watching a plane cut across the dark Arizona sky. And in that soft, empty moment, he whispers, "Only once. God, I hope they never have to use that button again." Then he turns out the light, and everything is still. By the second week after the Senate hearing, a new kind of panic had gripped the airline industry. But this time, it wasn't over fuel prices or labor strikes. It was over ethics scores. The Passenger Integrity Charter had just passed into federal law. It wasn't just policy now, it was mandatory. Every airline had 90 days to meet the FAA's new standards or face serious consequences. Suspension from federal airports, loss of government contracts, and public exposure via the newly unveiled Sky Ethics dashboard. Airline executives weren't sleeping. At Concordia Air's headquarters, 6 men in tailored suits sat in a dark boardroom staring at a screen displaying something they couldn't believe. Concordia Ethics Score, 62%. Non-compliant passenger discrimination reports. Last 12 months. 119 resolution time. AVG, 41 days crew retraining status. Overdue, 9 months. "What the hell is this?" one of them barked. Another slammed his coffee down. "This can't be public, can it?" "It is now," their legal chief muttered. "The dashboard went live this morning. Anyone with a phone can see this." "What's our recourse?" The ethics officer just said quietly, "Fix it. Fast." But fixing it wasn't as simple as checking a box. Because passengers weren't waiting 90 days, they were already pulling out receipts. One woman posted her own in-flight video where a flight attendant called her aggressive for asking for water twice. Another shared footage of her elderly father being ignored when boarding assistance was requested, despite being wheelchair flagged. The hashtag #SkyEthicsWatch started trending globally. It wasn't just Skynova anymore. It was every airline. Delta, Pacific Skies, Nova Jet, even upscale carriers like Eterna Lux. Everyone was suddenly exposed. And the public wasn't just watching, they were choosing, based on ethics scores. Back in Flagstaff, Walter and Henrietta sat with 2 guests in their living room, Lisa and Jeremy Holloway. Lisa had flown in from Atlanta. She was 42, black, and the new VP of Passenger Experience at a mid-tier carrier called Jet Front. "We need help," she said. "Our CEO wants to take this seriously, but they're panicking. I told them, we can't just scrub numbers. We need to rebuild culture, but I don't have a blueprint." Walter nodded. He stood, walked to his bookshelf, and pulled down a thick binder marked Ethics Evaluation, 2011 Draft. "I wrote this after the 2009 GAO audit. No one listened back then." He handed it to Lisa. She took it like it was a holy book. Walter looked her in the eye. "Don't treat it like damage control. Treat it like truth." In Los Angeles, the CEO of Pacific Skies wasn't listening. Instead of reforming, he launched a campaign to discredit the ethics dashboard, calling it overreach and bureaucratic shaming. He even claimed Walter Greaves had a political agenda. But that backfired, because within 24 hours, 4 whistleblowers from Pacific Skies came forward with internal crew chat logs referring to black passengers as cabin weight and Hispanic customers as boarding clutter. The FAA froze their compliance status overnight. They lost 3 international code-share partners in 72 hours. Meanwhile, a surprising trend emerged. Airlines with higher ethics scores began gaining market share. Flybright, a smaller carrier based in Colorado, jumped from 8% to 23% in online bookings after releasing their ethics training curriculum publicly and offering real-time support for passenger complaints. Their CEO made a simple video. "We know we're not perfect, but we're willing to be accountable, and that starts here." The clip got 6.7 million views. People began booking with ethics in mind. For the first time, passenger dignity had commercial value. Walter's name appeared in op-eds, think pieces, even TEDx talk invitations. But he declined every spotlight. When a CNN producer called and asked for an exclusive sit-down interview, his response was short. If they only care now, they didn't care when it mattered. Instead, he used his time quietly, building a model charter curriculum for FAA training schools, hosting private roundtables with retired captains, and most notably, helping local airports adapt real-time feedback systems. Henrietta, meanwhile, had begun sorting and answering the hundreds of letters they now received weekly. One was from a boy in Chicago. "My grandma said you're like Rosa Parks on an airplane. Is that true?" Henrietta smiled, folded the letter, and said softly, "No, baby." He just borrowed her courage. But not everyone was cheering. A conservative think tank, Flight Liberty Council, released a statement condemning the FAA reforms, claiming they shamed good American workers and created fear-based enforcement in the skies. The backlash gained some traction among fringe media. Foxwire ran headlines like, "Sky surveillance or safety? Do you trust the man in 2A? Ethics score equals social credit?" Walter didn't respond publicly. He didn't have to, because even as talking heads tried to spin the narrative, the data spoke louder. 43% drop in mid-air passenger conflict reports, 28% faster resolution of customer complaints. 2 major airlines voluntarily adopted stricter than required ethics benchmarks. The reform was working, and quietly, airlines began to understand. Compliance wasn't weakness, it was survival. Meanwhile, Sky Nova tried to rebuild. Their new ethics chief invited Walter to a confidential meeting at FAA headquarters. She came alone. No cameras, no PR crew. "I know we failed," she said. "I also know this won't be fixed overnight. But if you were me, what would you do first?" Walter paused, then leaned forward. "Let your crew talk, anonymously, with no fear. If they're afraid to speak inside, the whole plane becomes unsafe." She nodded, and for the first time since the scandal, he saw something in a Sky Nova leader's eyes he hadn't seen in months. Humility. By week 6, something remarkable happened. Airline crews, flight attendants, gate agents, even baggage handlers started organizing their own grassroots effort called Voices from the Cabin. Their slogan, "Respect isn't protocol, it's practice." They held town halls, filmed anonymous testimonials, and even created a red flag toolkit for new hires to recognize bias, de-escalate tension, and protect marginalized passengers. Walter watched from afar. He didn't join the movement. He'd already done what he needed to do. Now, it was theirs. On a quiet Thursday morning, Walter returned to Terminal 6 in Phoenix, where he and Henrietta had first boarded Flight 2317. He wasn't there to fly, just to walk. He stood at the gate quietly and watched boarding happen. This time, something was different. A white man tried to take an elderly Asian couple's assigned seat. The gate agent stepped in fast. "Sir, they're confirmed for row 3. Please return to your assigned seat. If you need assistance, we'll help you, but we won't displace another passenger." The man scoffed, but sat down. No shouting, no escalation, no headlines. just quiet dignity. Walter smiled, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel it. Not pride, but hope. 3 weeks after the FAA's ethics dashboard went public, the aviation industry felt like it was balancing on the edge of a blade. Some airlines rushed to comply. Others doubled down, dragging their feet while whispering legal threats behind closed doors. But what no one expected was this. International airports were watching, and they were about to act. At the Global Aviation Coalition Summit in Geneva, representatives from over 30 countries gathered to assess how the U.S. ethics reforms might affect international airspace agreements. Walter Greaves, of course, wasn't in the room, but his name was on the agenda. Item 4B, integration of FAA passenger ethics standards into transatlantic flight protocols. Proposal led by Netherlands, Canada, and Germany. It was unheard of. Passenger dignity wasn't just a national issue anymore, it was going global. And that terrified the old guard, especially the airlines that built their dominance on minimizing cost, maximizing volume, and treating people like seat numbers. Back in Washington, Walter received an email from FAA Chairwoman Haynes with a simple subject line. Keynote, Global Compliance Conference, July 14th, you're up. He stared at it for a few seconds, then showed Henrietta. You're really going to do it? She asked. He gave her a look. Guess they're not done with the old man just yet. The lead up to the conference was a storm. Airline lobbyists flooded congressional offices, trying to stall or water down the next wave of ethics requirements. A few even proposed exemptions for legacy carriers that had historic service to the public. Translation, protect the dinosaurs. But FAA didn't flinch. They were preparing something else. Behind the scenes, Chairwoman Haynes had drafted what she called the Blue Seal Mandate, a sweeping certification process that required not only onboard ethics standards, but also transparent complaint tracking independent passenger advocacy liaisons at every airport, annual audits of crew treatment toward elderly, disabled, and minority passengers, public scoring of every airline by a neutral third-party ethics body. It wasn't just policy anymore. It was going to be federal aviation law. But before she could announce it, the industry needed to hear from someone who wasn't a bureaucrat. They needed Walter. The night before the conference, Walter stood at the hotel balcony overlooking D.C., the Capitol dome glowing in the humid summer air. Henrietta joined him, tea in hand. You know what I'm proudest of? He asked. She smiled. That you didn't burn the whole system down? He chuckled. No, that you're still here. She leaned into him. We're both still standing. That's what matters. The next morning, the grand ballroom at the Conrad Hotel was standing room only. Executives, regulators, press, even international delegates filled the space. Walter walked slowly to the podium, no script in hand, just a folded page of notes tucked in his pocket. When he began to speak, his voice didn't boom. It didn't need to, because everyone leaned in. I'm not here to lecture you, he said. I'm here because I was the one who finally pressed the button that froze your systems. And if I had to do it again, I would. Murmurs. But not because I hate this industry. I love it. I've spent 40 years making it safer, smarter, faster, and now, fairer. He let that word sit. Fairness isn't a feature. It's a baseline. If your planes move millions but treat one grandmother like she doesn't matter, your system is broken. He pulled the paper from his pocket. These are 12 ethics principles I wrote down in 2011. No one cared about them then. They called them too soft, too idealistic. But now, they're your reality. He paused. Because a system is only as strong as how it treats the weakest person on board. Silence. Then someone clapped. Then another. Then the room stood up. That afternoon, Chairwoman Haynes took the stage and officially unveiled the Blue Seal Mandate. Every airline that wanted to fly in or out of federal U.S. airspace would need to comply. No exceptions. This isn't punishment, she said. It's permission. permission to operate in the skies that belong to all of us. To enforce it, the FAA announced the creation of a National Aviation Ethics Council, NAEC, a new regulatory body made up of legal experts, community advocates, aviation veterans, and yes, passengers. They would have the authority to suspend ethics certification, recommend federal fines, freeze boarding rights for non-compliant airlines, and the first honorary chair of the council, Walter Greaves. International press had a field day. The Guardian, From Silence to Sky Law, How One Man Redefined Passenger Dignity. Le Monde, Walter Greaves, L'architecte de l'éthique aérienne. The New York Times, Ethics in the Sky, FAA's most radical reform in 50 years. Even Foxwire, reluctant at first, ran a headline that surprised everyone. You may not agree with him, but he changed everything. Over the next 10 days, something remarkable happened. Sky Nova's ethics rating climbed from 61% to 78%. Concordia Air launched an internal ethics hotline and reported 52 retrainings within 48 hours flying. Bright announced it would offer real-time ethics feedback cards on every seatback by September. Airports in Canada, Japan, and the Netherlands officially adopted the FAA's charter into their own ethics frameworks. Passenger satisfaction jumped 22% in less than a month. Complaints dropped. Engagement rose. And more than that, the tone changed. Gate agents smiled more. Crew members listened longer. Elderly passengers were escorted instead of ignored. Kids got kind words, not side eyes. It wasn't just a shift in regulation. It was a cultural reset. One evening, Walter returned home to find a letter waiting by the door. It was from a first-year law student at Columbia University. Mr. Greaves, I was on the flight behind yours that day. I saw everything, and I did nothing. I've carried that guilt ever since. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like, not just in the moment, but in the aftermath. I've decided to study aviation law, because one day, I want to help people like your wife have the skies they deserve. Sincerely, Darius Holloway. Walter folded the letter, placed it inside his desk drawer, and didn't say a word, just smiled. The kind of smile that only comes when you know something finally shifted. Something that can't be undone. 2 weeks after the Blue Seal mandate became law, Henrietta Greaves stood in front of a different kind of audience. One not filled with CEOs or senators, but survivors. It was the first Passenger Dignity Forum, held in Chicago and hosted by the newly formed National Aviation Ethics Council. The room was filled with regular people, many elderly, many people of color, and far too many who had a story that had never been told. Henrietta hadn't planned to speak. She came to support Walter, but something shifted as she listened. A woman in her 70s told of being called confused and denied her medication on a 6-hour flight. A young black mother shared how her autistic son was duct taped to a seat midair after a minor meltdown. A military veteran said he was treated like a problem after requesting early boarding for his prosthetic leg. One by one, the stories fell like quiet thunder. Henrietta could feel something building in her chest. Walter saw her eyes. He knew that look. He didn't stop her when she stood. She walked slowly to the microphone. "My name is Henrietta Greaves," she said. "Some of you may have heard my name, but you don't know my voice." The room hushed. "I've sat on many planes. I've been served wine with a side of attitude. I've been talked to like I was invisible. I've been bumped, barked at, stared at like I didn't belong in a seat I paid for. But it wasn't until Flight 2317 that I realized this wasn't just bad luck. It was built in." She paused. "Sometimes the most violent thing isn't a slap or a shout. It's the silence when nobody stands up." Heads nodded. "I've been silent for decades, but not anymore." A wave of applause rose, not polite, but raw. And when she sat down, a woman across the room mouthed, "Thank you." Later that evening, Henrietta and Walter walked along Lake Michigan. The air was crisp, and the lights of the city shimmered like they had something to say. "I didn't mean to speak," Henrietta said. Walter smiled. "I'm glad you did." She was quiet for a moment. "I always thought your voice would be the one that changed things." "It was never going to be just mine," he replied. "But yours? Yours makes it real." Back in Phoenix, a high school senior named Janelle Porter watched the forum live stream from her laptop. She hadn't flown since she was 11, after a flight attendant told her she was too fidgety and asked her mom to discipline her better. She remembered crying in the airport bathroom, but after watching Henrietta, Janelle reopened her college email folder. Her top choice? University of Michigan. But the scholarship included travel. She clicked accept. Something inside her whispered, "You'll fly again. On your terms." Across the country, more voices began to rise. A retired Delta flight attendant launched a YouTube channel sharing anonymous crew testimonies on how they were pressured to ignore racist complaints. A Filipino-American businessman started a petition demanding ethics translation protocols for non-native English speakers at boarding gates. And in Baltimore, a group of black grandmothers began hosting Know Your Rights at 30,000 Feet workshops at local churches. This wasn't a movement anymore. It was a reckoning. Back in D.C., Walter received a call from Chairwoman Haynes. "We're expanding the NAEC," she said. "We need someone to lead the passenger stories division. Someone who understands that numbers are cold, but stories change hearts." He didn't hesitate. "Henrietta will do it." There was a pause. "Are you sure?" Haynes asked. She's lived it. That's all that matters." A week later, Henrietta sat in her new office, modest, sunlit, quiet. Her inbox had over 3,200 messages. She didn't flinch. She opened the first one. "My name is Carlos Jimenez. I watched my mother cry after a gate agent asked if she could read English. She's lived here for 46 years. I don't want revenge. I just want her to be treated like she belongs." Henrietta pressed reply. She didn't write a statement or a form letter. Just this. "She does. And we're going to make sure everyone knows it." The shift wasn't loud. It was quiet, systemic, relentless. Exactly 23 days after the FAA's Blue Seal mandate took effect, the European Aviation Standards Council voted unanimously to adopt the same ethics framework, starting with Heathrow, Schiphol, and Charles de Gaulle. Then came Toronto Pearson, then Changi in Singapore, then Sydney. One by one, the world's most powerful airports aligned like falling dominoes. And suddenly, any airline operating through international terminals had a simple choice: adapt or be grounded. Back in the US, Skynova's executive board met in a closed-door emergency session. The atmosphere was tense. Their international boarding rights were under review, and the ethics compliance dashboard didn't look good. Crew retraining incomplete. Passenger resolution system delayed. First-class bias complaints up 14% since April. And at the center of it all, one single unresolved incident kept flashing red on the board. Flight 231 seen. Ethics violation. Elderly couple removed from first-class seat for white passengers. They had tried to ignore it, tried to bury it, even tried to spin it. But the name Walter Greaves wouldn't disappear. Now it was printed in every ethics report from here to Brussels. And worse, Henrietta Greaves had just launched a division that reviewed stories like hers and archived them in a public access database. Passengers could search their own flights, see who was involved, submit their own reports. It was no longer just a system. It was a spotlight. At FAA headquarters, Chairwoman Haynes stood by the tinted windows overlooking Capitol Hill. She held the new data summary in her hand. In the first 3 weeks, 312 airlines had updated internal ethics protocols. 9 airports had temporarily suspended boarding rights for non-compliant carriers. $1.12 billion in ESG-aligned aviation funding was frozen pending review. And perhaps most telling of all, Public trust ratings in the airline industry had jumped 19%. Not because the planes were faster, not because the food improved, but because dignity was finally measurable. Meanwhile, Walter sat alone at a small diner in Ashland, Oregon, reading an op-ed from The Atlantic. For decades, we flew with anxiety not just about turbulence, but about treatment. The Blue Seal era has changed the sky forever, and at the center of it is a retired engineer who reminded us, silence is not safety. He folded the paper, sipped his coffee, and nodded to himself, not in pride, but in peace. That afternoon, Henrietta received a call she didn't expect, from an attorney representing Sky Nova. They wanted to talk. She invited them to a public ethics roundtable instead. No closed doors, she said. If you're ready to change, do it where people can see it. They declined. Then, 4 days later, Sky Nova's ethics score dropped below compliance threshold, and in response, Toronto and Frankfurt both suspended cooperation. Over 94 flights were canceled in 36 hours. Investors panicked. Share prices dropped 11%. An emergency statement was issued. Sky Nova Airlines acknowledges failure to meet the standards of Blue Seal compliance and commits to full ethics integration by Q4. But by then, the public had already drawn its conclusion. The damage wasn't just to the schedule, it was to the brand. News anchors picked it up fast. CNN. Ethics Now grounds flights. A new era in global travel. NPR. Passengers win. Airlines can no longer hide behind policy. BBC. North American aviation faces reckoning over treatment of vulnerable flyers. Even YouTube creators got involved. Clips of Henrietta's speech trended under #SkyDignity. TikTokers stitched their own flight stories. Instagram travel influencers began tagging airlines with real-time ethics ratings mid-trip. It wasn't protest, it was participation. In a small corner of South Carolina, a retired black veteran named Gerald watched all this unfold. He hadn't flown since 2009, not since a flight attendant made him get up mid-flight to let a white passenger sit with her husband. His wife, Maybelle, never flew again after that. He pulled out his wallet, unfolded an old boarding pass he had kept, not out of nostalgia, but memory. Then he picked up the phone. "Baby," he told his granddaughter, "get your camera ready. We're going to take a trip." In Chicago, Henrietta logged off her last call of the day and opened a final letter that had been forwarded from her old address. Inside was a small card, no return address. Mrs. Greaves, you didn't just change the flight. You changed the altitude of how we're seen. Keep going. 3B, row 2. She stared at the handwriting. She remembered the young flight attendant who hadn't said a word that day, only looked away in shame. And now? Now someone had found the courage to speak. Henrietta smiled gently, because this wasn't just about the systems anymore. It was about the ripples. And ripples, when pushed hard enough, could change the tide. The hearing room on Capitol Hill was packed. Cameras lined the walls. Reporters whispered into phones. Senate staff shuffled papers while checking live feeds. The plaque on the dais read, Senate Oversight Committee on Transportation Ethics Reform. Date, September 3rd. Subject, the impact of the Blue Seal mandate. At the center table sat Henrietta and Walter Greaves. Not as victims, not as guests, but as key witnesses. Walter wore a dark gray suit. Henrietta wore her signature navy shawl. They sat with the calm of people who had nothing left to prove, and everything still worth defending. When Chairwoman Althea Boyd gavelled the room into silence, she leaned forward, locking eyes with the audience. "I want to remind everyone," she said, "that today's hearing is not just about numbers. It's about what happens when dignity is treated as optional." Then she turned to Henrietta. "Mrs. Greaves, would you please begin?" Henrietta's voice was soft but steady. "I didn't come here as an expert," she said. "I came as someone who was told, in front of a full plane, that my place didn't matter." She paused, eyes scanning the senators. I've been told I should be grateful we were allowed back on board after we complied. But what does that say? That following injustice quietly is the price of peace. No one should have to choose silence just to stay on schedule. There was no applause in the chamber, just stillness. Then Senator Camden, who had voted against the Blue Seal mandate months prior, leaned in. Mrs. Greaves, with all due respect, your experience was one flight. Are we reshaping an entire global framework around one anecdote? Walter cleared his throat. With all due respect, Senator, he said plainly, our story just happened to be the one that hit your desk. He reached into his leather folder and pulled out a bound file, marked with FAA seal and time-stamped from 2 weeks earlier. Inside this, Walter said, are 4317 stories submitted through the Passenger Dignity Database since the Blue Seal went live, from 41 states, multiple age groups, dozens of ethnicities. He slid it across the table. I recommend you read what people have been carrying in silence for decades. Camden didn't reply, but the cameras caught the moment his expression changed. Outside the hearing, the hallway buzzed. Microphones were raised. Questions fired. But Walter and Henrietta didn't stop to speak. Instead, they walked quietly to the plaza, where a bronze sculpture of Frederick Douglass stood with his back to the Capitol, looking outward. Henrietta stood beside it for a moment. You think this will last? She asked. Walter looked at the statue, then at her. It will, if the next person after us doesn't wait 50 years to speak. They sat on the bench nearby. For a while, they just watched the traffic, the people, the sky. Henrietta pulled out her phone. A new message flashed. From Passenger Ethics at eu.cive.gov. Subject, Blue Seal, adopted across 27 member states. Effective next quarter, ethics compliance will be required for all transatlantic routes. Henrietta handed the phone to Walter. He read it. He smiled. And for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel like just two names in a report. They felt like two people who made the sky a little clearer, not just for themselves, but for everyone who'd ever been told, you don't belong here. 6 months later, Henrietta stood at the edge of a terminal window in Zurich, not waiting for a flight, not boarding, just watching. Beyond the glass, a Sky Nova jet was parked silently on the tarmac. No passengers boarding, no crew in sight. A red digital ticker on the nearby wall flashed. Sky Nova Flight 876, delayed, pending ethics clearance. She smiled, not in spite, but in recognition. The world had changed. Behind her, the corridor bustled with travelers, business people, families, tourists. Some stopped by a screen labeled Blue Seal Dashboard, Real-Time Airline Ethics Index. The screen showed a live ethics score for every airline, color-coded, transparent, updated hourly. A teenager standing next to her looked at it, then at his mother. Sky Nova's still yellow, he said. Let's fly with Delta Clear. They walked off, just like that. No fuss, no protest, just choice. Back in Washington, D.C., Senator Althea Boyd stood in front of a press pool, holding a new binder labeled Passenger Dignity Act, International Charter. She spoke clearly. The skies are no longer just highways for profit, she said. They are corridors of human experience, and that experience must now be just as regulated as fuel or altitude. Reporters raised hands. What if airlines refused to comply with the full Blue Seal standard? Boyd didn't hesitate. Then they don't fly. Walter, meanwhile, was home. Not in his usual armchair, but out in the garden, trimming the azaleas. He moved slowly, deliberately. His cane leaned against the wooden fence. Henrietta came out, holding 2 glasses of iced-on tea. You're up early, she said. Trying to beat the squirrels, he muttered. She laughed and handed him a glass. They sat down beneath the old magnolia tree. A bird hopped between branches above them, chirping without a care. You know what I realized this morning? Henrietta asked. What? That for 52 years we flew under the assumption that if something went wrong, we'd just keep quiet. Walter nodded. And now? Now, if something goes wrong, the world hears about it before the plane lands. Later that afternoon, a package arrived. No sender listed, just a simple white envelope, hand-delivered. Inside was a first-class boarding pass, embossed, gilded, pristine. Attached was a handwritten note. To Mr. and Mrs. Greaves, as a direct result of your courage, Sky Nova has joined the Global Passenger Dignity Network. We thank you. We owe you. Should you ever wish to fly with us again, this seat is yours, forever. Sincerely, the new CEO. Sky Nova Group. Henrietta placed the envelope back in the box. We won't use it, she said. Walter smiled. Doesn't mean it's not earned. They sat in silence again, watching as the wind rustled the trees. Then Henrietta whispered softly, not to Walter, but maybe to God, or maybe to herself. It only took one moment of disrespect to make the sky feel cruel. She looked toward the open blue above them, but it only took one decision to make it sacred again. And just like that, the wind calmed, and the world felt lighter. 3 years later, Walter Greaves was no longer walking with a cane. He used a walker now. Slower, steadier, but still standing tall. The Blue Seal Summit was held that year in Geneva, at the Grand Convention Center overlooking Lake Leman. Delegates from 42 countries, executives, politicians, civil rights leaders, even students. And right at the heart of it all, 2 reserved seats at the front, labeled Mr. Walter Greaves, Mrs. Henrietta Greaves. They didn't ask to be in the spotlight, but the spotlight had learned to follow those who moved with quiet weight. On stage, the FAA chairwoman took the podium. For too long, we believed passenger safety meant only physical safety, she said. But what about the safety of dignity? The safety of being seen, of being human? She paused. When Mr. and Mrs. Greaves stood up, silently, gracefully, and refused to be erased, they rewrote the industry's conscience. A standing ovation rose before she could finish. Henrietta glanced at Walter, who chuckled under his breath. This is more applause than when I retired after 38 years of engineering, he whispered. She smiled. That's because back then, you were just making planes fly. Now you're making them land right. Later that evening, they were invited to a private dinner. Low lighting, crisp linen napkins. No press. Just a few officials and their spouses. A woman in her 40s approached the table. She looked nervous, holding a name badge that read, Anita Reynolds, Chief Training Officer, Sky Nova International. Henrietta recognized her face immediately. You were on our flight, Henrietta said. Weren't you? Anita nodded slowly. I didn't speak up that day. I froze, and I regretted it every day since. Walter looked at her gently. You're speaking now. Anita exhaled, like she had waited 3 years to do just that. I rewrote the flight attendant training curriculum, she said quietly. Every crew member under Sky Nova now goes through the Passenger Integrity Protocol. And yes, your story is part of the opening lesson. Henrietta didn't say anything. She simply reached over and placed a hand over Anita's. Forgiveness didn't need words, only courage. Back in Ashland a week later, Walter received a package in the mail. No return address again, just a note that read, In honor of your legacy, the final launch code of the Blue Seal Airspace Integrity System, Gate 42, has been named after you, Greaves 1. Inside was a commemorative gold plaque, simple, elegant. He stared at it, tracing the lettering with his fingertips. It didn't make him feel powerful. It made him feel responsible. That Sunday, Henrietta stood at the front of their small church, holding a tiny piece of paper. She didn't give sermons, but this one was different. Some of you may know what happened to Walter and me, she began. But this isn't a story about punishment. It's about presence. She looked across the pews. God doesn't always roar. Sometimes he whispers, in the form of a stewardess who doesn't say a word, or a passenger who writes a letter, or a little girl who tells her parents, "That wasn't right." She smiled gently. And sometimes he moves through two tired people just trying to sit next to each other. The room was still and full. That night, Walter sat on the porch, looking up at the stars. Henrietta joined him, wrapping a light blanket around her shoulders. "You ever think we went too far?" she asked. "No," he said, without missing a beat. "We just finally went far enough." They looked up again. The sky above them, vast, quiet, changed, and this time, it felt like it belonged to everyone. Have you or someone you love ever been treated like you didn't belong? Just because of how you looked, spoke, or where you sat? Tell us where you're watching from, and let us know. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? We read every comment, and sometimes your story is the one that changes everything.